Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare Podcast. This is episode number 1, the Shakespeare Podcast origin story. So where does the Shakespeare Podcast come from? I'm a Shakespeare guy. I used to teach Elizabethan and Jacobean drama in a university in China. It wasn't called that, of course. That would frighten the students. It was called Shakespeare in His Time. A few months ago, I was watching a film version of Shakespeare's King Lear with a teenage student. It was the opening of the play, the abdication scene, and my teenage friend asked me to explain what was happening. As I explained the scene, I realised that he didn't understand anything, that he hadn't understood a word that had been said, and consequently had no idea what was happening, what the plot was, what the characters were doing. The whole play was lost to him. So the Shakespeare Podcast is designed to solve that problem. It's a free podcast for anyone who's studying Shakespeare and finding it difficult. There may be a whole host of reasons why Shakespeare doesn't make any sense to you. And I'm going to take each problem one by one, break it down so that it's easy to understand. And because it's a podcast, you can listen to it whenever you want, or whenever you feel the need to. If you're a student, think of the Shakespeare Podcast as a shortcut. If you're a parent, think of the Shakespeare Podcast as, quote, free grinds. And if you're a teacher, think of the Shakespeare Podcast as a teaching aid you can use in class, or as a helpful reference for students if they need some additional help. So this podcast will make Shakespeare easier, and we'll start with Shakespeare's language. Taking the language of Shakespeare and translating it into contemporary English is the first thing we'll do. Shakespeare writes in what is known as early modern English, which is a long way from the English that we use today. It's not completely impenetrable, but for many people, Shakespeare's language is difficult for somebody who speaks contemporary English. And it can make a world of difference when it comes to understanding what's going on in a play. So, for example, in Hamlet, in Act 1, Scene 1, Horatio says, "Before my God, I might not this believe without the sensible and true avouch of mine own eyes." What he means is he's just seen a ghost, and he wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't have seen it for himself. Another problem with Shakespeare's text is that many of the references that Shakespeare has are out of date. Our attitudes to some subjects might have shifted substantially over the last 420 years. For example, in Macbeth, modern audiences sometimes find it difficult to understand the supernatural element in the play, the weird sisters or the witches, which is why there will be a whole podcast dedicated to just that subject coming right up, where else but in the future. Other ideas are now completely obsolete. In Macbeth, we have the idea of the divine right of kings. So again, there's a podcast entitled Introducing Macbeth, in which I'll give you a full rundown on what the idea is, why it's important to the play, and how it turns up in the play. Thirdly, there's a lot of Shakespeare's plays that have different things happening at the same time. So the Shakespeare Podcast aims to separate out different themes and different characters and break them down into their simplest component parts. That's why, for example, the Shakespeare Podcast has a whole episode just on Lady Macbeth, what she's saying, what she's doing, and how she fits into the play as a whole. But as you'll see with many Shakespeare plays, what you have happening at the same time is a family drama, a political story, and a tragedy. And because they're all happening simultaneously, it can seem very dense and very complicated. So we'll break that down and make it as simple as possible. Having said all that, there are aspects of Shakespeare's plays that are universal, like murders, like ambition, like mental health issues. And the Shakespeare podcast will focus on Shakespeare's enduring appeal for audiences, and why Shakespeare's work is still relevant today, and why he's considered to be the greatest dramatist that ever lived. One interpretation of Macbeth is that it describes the rise of a dictator and a tyrant, and provides a blueprint for how you deal with a tyrant and a dictator and how you stop him. Does that sound familiar? Can you think of any instance where one person has grabbed power for whatever it takes and at whatever cost for everyone else? So over the coming weeks, the Shakespeare podcast will introduce you to Shakespeare's work and his life, and then we'll start to look at Macbeth the play and the character, so that as a student of Shakespeare you can gain a clear understanding of what's happening in a very short space of time. I'll explain why the play was written and where it comes from. There's a podcast, for example, that covers the story of the play, so that you know what's happening from Act 1 to Act 5. And therefore you'll have a map in your head about what's happening in what part of the play. Lady Macbeth kills herself, that would be Act 5. Banquo is murdered, that would be Act 3. If you have an easy 20-minute guide to what's happening where in the play, you're going to find understanding the play so much easier. Then we'll do the same with Hamlet. Where did the play come from? Why did Shakespeare write Hamlet? What was happening on the London theatre scene when Hamlet came to the stage? Then I'll do an act-by-act breakdown of what's happening in the play. A quick guide on who kills who and who's lying about what. Later in the series, I'll do introductions to other plays like The Merchant of Venice and As You Like It. But for now, I hope this podcast will work for you, answer some basic questions you might not want to ask, and make Shakespeare easier to understand. You might be a student who doesn't have a great deal of time, and the Shakespeare podcast is a simple way to learn a Shakespeare text while eating your dinner or going for a run. You can study on the go, making Shakespeare both easier and entertaining. By the end of these podcasts, hopefully Shakespeare won't feel so difficult, and you'll be ready to take him on whatever happens. If you've enjoyed this podcast and you're looking forward to the ones that are about to drop, please press like and subscribe, as it helps the algorithm know who you are so that you don't get lost like tears in rain.